So before we turn to these stories of Luke's account of Jesus lifting up the lowly, I want you to understand something about the biblical background and the biblical world in which Jesus is ministering. So one commentator noted of women in the ancient world, women were considered important only to the extent that they impacted the lives of men. Think about that. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who lived during the time of Christ, said this: "The minds of women are in some degree weaker than those of men and are not so well able to comprehend a thing which is appreciable only by the intellect." I mean, that's just offensive, but that's the world in which Jesus is ministering. The first century Jewish historian Josephus, regarding the courts, said, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted," because it couldn't be trusted, it couldn't be believed, they couldn't be taken seriously, he believed. A first century Jewish blessing that was prayed every morning by Jewish men, and to this day there are sects within Judaism who continue to pray this prayer every day. This is just a part of it. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has not made me a woman." Right? This is the mindset in the first century. So some first century rabbis said that women shouldn't be taught the Torah because they just get confused by it, or they would confuse it and twist it. And they said, teaching a woman Torah is like teaching her obscenities. It was just something that wasn't to be done. And women, of course, were not allowed to be rabbis. They were not allowed to be priests. They were not allowed to be teachers of men when it came to faith. It doesn't mean that women weren't loved by their husbands or by their parents or grandparents, but it does mean that they were held in a very different status than men. They were held in a kind of second-class status, and sometimes even lower than that. And this wasn't just true in the Bible and in Judaism. It was true across the ancient world. There are, by some counts, 1,700 unique individuals who are named in the Bible, in the entire Bible, 1,700. So the number of men versus the number of women that are named, that have names, 1,563 men are named, only 137 women are named. I mean, it's 11 to 1, the ratio of men being named to women being named. I remember when I gave our third grade daughter, or our third grader, Rebecca, our youngest daughter, when I gave her third grade Bible. So this is years ago, because she's now in her early 30s. But when I gave her third grade Bible, I said, "Okay, I really want you to read this, Rebecca. I want you to read it. If she's 8 years old, I want you to read it from the beginning. You read it, and then we'll talk about it when you go to bed, when I come to put you to bed at night." And so one night, like 3 weeks into reading the book of Genesis, she said to me, "Daddy, how come the girls don't have any names?" And then she said, "And why are the boys so mean to the girls sometimes?" And she continued with her questions, and she's asking me these questions. She said, "Why do all the boys get the best parts?" And I finally, after listening to her questions, I'm like, wow, I didn't expect my 8-year-old to ask these kind of questions. And this is what I finally said: "Becca, how about if we just skip to the Gospel of Luke?" Because the Gospel of Luke paints a different picture than what we find in the rest of Scripture. Now, Luke mentions women by name more often than all of the other Gospels. He tells more stories about women. Women have more lines that they speak in the Gospel of Luke than any of the other Gospels. And we're going to see here that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is continually lifting up women, showing compassion to them, ministering with them, valuing them. So against this backdrop of everything we've learned in the ancient world, let's delve in to the Gospel of Luke. So Luke begins in chapters 1 and 2 with the amazing stories of Anna and Simeon and Zechariah and Elizabeth. And then there's Mary in there as well. But I want you to notice that of those 5 characters in the first 2 chapters, Elizabeth and Mary and Anna are all there and have major roles to play. They are central to God's saving work, God's saving plans for the entire world. So we studied that last week, but I want us to just recognize that up front. If you go through the rest of the Gospel of Luke, and if you have a Bible with you, I hope you'll thumb through the pages with me. Turn to chapter 4, and we find one of the first miracles that Jesus does is he goes to Peter's house to heal his mother-in-law of a fever. Turn to Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 16, and there's a widow who's grieving because her son has just died. She's grieving, and Jesus sees her grieving, and he stops what he's doing, and he has compassion on her, and he raises her son from the dead. If you turn to Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 56, Jesus heals a 12-year-old daughter of the leader of the synagogue and raises her up, goes to her home, touches her, lifts her up, even though she's dead. And you weren't to touch someone who was dead. That made you unclean. Jesus reached out and touched her and lifted her up and healed this 12-year-old. While he's on his way, there's a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. She's had a perpetual period. In essence, this is what's happening. We think maybe it was endometriosis that led to a regular bleeding. She was unclean in the eyes of the law. If you couldn't touch her, you couldn't sleep on the same bed with her. She was socially ostracized from her community. And Jesus, she reaches out, touches the hem of his garment, and he turns around and he sees her. and he offers her his blessing and calls her his daughter. I mean, it's just this beautiful scene in Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 56. In Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17, Jesus heals a woman in a synagogue. She's been disabled for 18 years, and Jesus stops to heal her, much to the consternation of the rabbi there, who says you're not supposed to heal on the Sabbath, but Jesus couldn't wait to heal her. This only shows up in Luke's gospel, this story. Then we find in Luke that the women were at the crucifixion. They were there, all of these women who had followed Jesus, and then they were there again at the resurrection. And the first people to see that Jesus was raised from the dead, the first people to proclaim that he was raised from the dead, were women. This is what we find in Luke's gospel. There's a few stories I haven't told you that I want to read to you right now. I want to just focus on them in the time that remains. The first one is in Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. So if you have your Bible, turn there. And here we read these words. Jesus traveled through the cities and villages, preaching and proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom. The 12, meaning the disciples, were with him, along with some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses. These are women that presumably Jesus had healed. Among them were Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had been thrown out. Joanna, the wife of Herod's servant Chuza, and he was the one who ran Herod's entire household, very wealthy. And so we have Joanna, who was a wealthy follower of Jesus, and then we have Susanna and many others. So there were a lot of other women besides them who, listen, provided for the disciples and Jesus out of their resources. So these women traveled with Jesus wherever he went. They undoubtedly helped with whatever they were doing, the disciples were doing. They were not allowed to be called disciples in the first century, but this is what they were. They were followers of Jesus, and they provided the means to feed the disciples and Jesus himself. And so they are doing more even than the other disciples are doing. This is a really important passage. It tells us that it wasn't just the 12 disciples and Jesus. There was a whole group of women that Jesus had brought healing to that were following him, that were involved in the ministry with him. We would call them today, clearly, disciples of Jesus. And among those were some, Mary Magdalene in particular, who had had 7 demons cast out of her. Let me just remind you that demon possessions or demon affliction in the first century was used to explain all kinds of things that today we would think of as mental illness, or epilepsy was explained in this way. Fevers were sometimes explained as demon affliction. And so whatever it was that had happened to Mary Magdalene, she was seriously afflicted. Maybe it was depression. Maybe it was anxiety. Maybe it was, she was bipolar. Maybe there was, schizophrenia. We don't know what it was, but we do know that she was somebody who was deeply disturbed and really troubled and a lot of pain in her life. But like these other women, Jesus had compassion for her and delivered her and then called her to be one of his disciples. All right, only in Luke do we learn that Jesus has cast these 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene. Only in Luke do we learn that these women at this point in Jesus' ministry were following him wherever he was going. Only in Luke do we have the names of some of these other women. We know about Mary Magdalene, but we don't know about some of these other women in the Gospels. Now, one point conservative and fundamentalist Christians are struggling with today, and we are not conservative fundamentalists here. We are, we're progressive evangelicals, or we're mainline Christians, or have whatever terminology you want to use. But in conservative evangelical and fundamentalist circles today, the big debate is on whether women can teach or preach or be in leadership in the church. You may know that Beth Moore, who is one of the best-known female teachers across the country, that there are churches that would not, in her own denomination, that would not let her preach in the church because they believed that women should keep silent in the church, as Paul had taught in one of his epistles, that women were not allowed to teach a man, that women were to be submitting to the authority of a man. So this idea that women could not be preaching and teaching in their churches. So this is a big debate for some in mainline circles, in the United Methodist Church in particular. This was settled, well, not that long ago, actually. 1956 was the first woman who was fully ordained in the Methodist Church that became the United Methodist Church in 1956. And so at least for almost 70 years, we have had female pastors. Half of our pastors here at Church of the Resurrection, maybe more, are women. I'm so grateful for their leadership and ministry. And in fact, had I not been gone for 3 weeks in a row for vacation and study leave, I would be having one of them preach the sermon today. All right, so Luke names women. He calls them. They are de facto disciples, even if they can't use that name in the first century. So one interesting point about this is when Luke is writing his gospel, so this is just a little Bible background that you might find interesting. So we have 4 gospels. John sort of stands apart from the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And scholars look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they say that at least many of them believe that there were 4 sources for the material that Matthew, Mark, and Luke use. Actually, primarily Matthew and Luke use. This is called the 4-source hypothesis about the first 3 gospels. And as we look at this, they say, well, we can see that Mark was used by both Matthew and Luke. So Matthew and Luke had access to Mark. 76% of what's in Mark shows up in Matthew and Luke's Gospels, and they're drawing upon that same material. So 76% of Mark shows up in both Matthew and Luke. And then there's small portions of Mark that show up only in Matthew and small portions only in Luke. And then there's some common teaching material that Matthew and Luke quote that Mark doesn't have, and that's often called Q. If you've ever heard of Q, means source. It comes from the German Quelle, which means source. And so this was teaching material that was probably gathered and written down before the Gospels were written. And then finally, there's unique material to Matthew and to Luke. And let me just show you what this looks like. This is a chart that helps us see how Matthew and Luke were likely formed, and they both draw upon Mark, and they both draw upon Q. But then unique material for Matthew is called M, for material unique to Matthew, and the unique material to Luke is called L for Luke. When we look at this, many of the stories about women are in the unique material that informed Luke's gospel, that doesn't show up in Matthew or Mark. And some scholars have suggested that Luke's source for that were these women who followed Jesus wherever he went. And they saw things differently than the men did. They had compassion. They saw the stories about women, and they remembered those stories, and they passed those on to Luke as he was writing his gospel.